Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking in Worship. My name is Dan Shields. I'm a worship pastor here at Orchard Hill Church.
My name is Chris Jamison. I'm a worship leader here at Orchard Hill Church as well, and...
My name is David Bowens, and I am also a worship leader here at Orchard Hill Church.
And this Walking in Worship podcast is designed just to help all of us grow in our faith and understanding of what worship really is.
Today we'll be continuing our conversation on Chapter 4 of Zach Neese's book, How to Worship a King.
So on page 53, it talks about the worship of God, and it says here, the first thing I would like to look at is the word itself, worship. It's compressed form of the Old English term worthship, and it literally means to give something of worth, to demonstrate an attribute value. And then he says this, demonstrating value costs something. To value something, we have to put a price on it, and that's why worship is so often associated with sacrifice. We make a sacrifice for something or someone that's important to us, something valuable. And then I really like this part here. He says, worship is a sacrifice. If you remember, it says in the word, we bring a sacrifice of praise. Hebrews 13:15, I think, the fruit of lips. The first mention of worship in Bible is in Genesis 22:5, when Abraham is bringing up his son Isaac to the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice to the Lord. And we all know that story, where Abraham was bringing his beloved son, who all the promises relied on, because God said, I'll make you a great nation. He only had one son, one legitimate son, and he was called to sacrifice that son, which is kind of interesting because, that son, a lot of people think of him as a little boy or something like that, but he actually carried the wood for the sacrifice up the side of the mountain. So most commentators think that he was like 12, 13, 14, even 15 years old. Mm-hmm. And he was asking, he's like, Dad,
what are we doing?
Where's the sacrifice? Yeah. It's like, you got a big knife, you got the wood,
I'm a little confused,
but I'm the
here.
only one that's here. Like, something seems wrong about this. But I've always thought that was an amazing story too, because Isaac laid down to allow himself to be a sacrifice. I mean, really.
So if he was old enough, then...
He probably could have defended himself.
And you got to think, Abraham was old as crap.
Right.
Yeah.
He was what,
He was
100
old.
and something.
He
He could definitely beat Abraham in a race, for sure.
Like, he could push him down like, oh, man, I'm going to break your hip. Now, 100 back then
right.
is different than 100 now,
fallen
guaranteed.
And I can't get up. Yeah,
Because
right.
Abraham ended up living to what, like 800, 900 something?
No, he
Not as
didn't.
old?
But yeah,
Can you imagine
he was
living
still an
until
old
you were
man.
800?
It would be
Hey, what are you guys
insane.
doing today? Celebrating my dad's birthday. He's 759. Really looking forward to the
You
party.
should see the size of the cake we had to get to put all those candles on it. Yeah, exactly.
Insane.
So, when we come oftentimes, and I've shared this with the team sometimes, like we come on, 2 o'clock or whatever on a beautiful sunny Saturday afternoon in the summertime, and, you're out at the pool or doing some cool stuff or whatever it is, and the last place you want to be is inside a closed-in area with no windows and no lights. You want to be outside, or, you're just tired or whatever it is. And one of the things I found, though, is when I come, especially when I would just show up to church, and I'd be like, I'm tired, I don't want to go to church, so not leading from the stage, I would have some of the most powerful worship experiences. I felt like those were the times when maybe it was even like the enemy saying, don't go to church, But I would make that choice, and there would be an active choice where I would go to church. And like they were powerful times, but there was that act of volition. And even for us on stage, there's that act of volition. I heard the story about the guy who was telling his wife, he said, I don't want to go to church this morning. She said, you have to go to church. And he said, I don't want to go to church. I don't like those people. And she said, I know, I understand that, but you really need to go to church. And he said, yeah, but they don't even like me. And she said, oh, they like you more than you think, but you have to go to church. And he said, why do I have to go to church? And she said, well, you're the pastor. We as worship leaders, we can have that feeling of like...
I was wondering where you were going with that.
Yeah.
I was like, oh.
We can have that feeling, though, like of obligation. And, even if like we're on staff here, but, some of the folks on our team who are just showing up, they've worked a 55-hour week or a 60-hour week. They've got kids. They're running around. They're doing all this stuff. And then they've got to spend a dozen hours with us worshiping. And you have to ask the question, why? Why do they do that? And what's God's feeling towards that as far as it being a sacrifice of praise? What do you guys think on that?
I like the paragraph speaking to that whole point on 54 where he says, we sacrifice when we offer God our time, our money, our songs of praise, when our circumstances don't look praiseworthy. An attitude of gratitude when we feel like grumbling. A sacrifice is often uncomfortable and always has a price. The thing that came to my head as you were talking, Dan, is the, like, coming in on a Saturday, like viewing that, what Jesus did for us was the greatest sacrifice. Me coming in on a Saturday at 3 feels like this is nowhere near the sacrifice that he went through on our behalf. I got to come here, or like even look at, since we're getting close to look at the Christmas time. Yeah. It's like, well, we have 15 services, and not everyone that's in those services is on staff. That's a sacrifice too. It's still not the greatest sacrifice. I guess I always have a hard, part of me is like, well, it's a sacrifice, but in the grand scheme of things,
it ain't nothing
compared to what he
did.
What he had to go through.
Yeah,
but that's not to say that our sacrifices aren't, because I don't want it to come across as like our sacrifices aren't.
That's not to belittle that at all, because sacrifice is sacrifice, pain is pain.
Yeah,
and we all need a certain level of balance in our life and stuff too. So we get that, but I think that's true. There is that certain level of sacrifice when we come in, or even when we worship and we don't feel like really worshiping. Crossing that line and saying, I am going to determine to worship. It's an act of volition. It's not just how I feel. It's easy to sing, we bring a sacrifice of praise, and feel good about it. But when you don't feel like it, that's really hard to step up on stage and say, you know what, I am going to determine to worship in this place. I'm not just going to make music, but I'm going to engage with God, and I'm going to give Him His worthship.
And what a blessing really that is what our sacrifice is. Because it could be a lot. There could be a lot more that we have to sacrifice, but because of what Jesus accomplished, what a blessing for us.
Currently, I mean, all around the world, I've heard that more people are suffering persecution today for being Christians than ever before.
Jeez.
Now, the population is larger, but still, I mean, you talk to people in China or North Korea or Iran, all through the Middle East. I might have shared this before, but I was at a conference once, and I might have been in Korea, I can't remember. And this, I was talking to a pastor from Jordan, and most people, in church world, whether it's a big church or a small church, they'll say that they have the same problems. It's the 80-20 thing. 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And, if we had a little bit more resources, we could do a lot more, people not being quite engaged enough and stuff. But I asked him, I said, what's the biggest challenge you face? And he, without blinking an eye, he said, the biggest challenge we face is if somebody becomes a Christian and they proclaim their Christianity, their family will kill them.
Their own family.
Yeah, well, that makes evangelism much more complicated when if I proclaim Christ, my family is coming after me to kill me. So there are people who still are laying their lives on the line. So not just coming, showing up on a Sunday afternoon on Saturday, but nonetheless, that's still a sacrifice for us. What's your thoughts, David, on how do we engage in worship in those times? I mean, what's the difference of us really turning our eyes towards God or towards ourselves?
I think it reminds me, all three of us are married, so this is relevant for us, but it reminds me of marriage. And love is not this flowery idea. It is a constant choice, the constant reminder that I had to learn early on in my marriage that at first I thought love was all these flowery moments and these wonderful times and I didn't realize love was a constant choice, an intentional decision that I had to decide no matter what I felt like, no matter how she made me feel, how I made her feel, or how things were going, if I was getting everything I wanted or not getting anything I wanted. I had to decide every single day that I'm going to love this woman and be who I am called to be to her. I think worship is similar to that. It's something that God calls us to do and to submit to Him. It had nothing to do with how we felt. It has to be a decision of, do we love the Lord? And if we love the Lord, the next natural and most real thing as we understand it is to worship Him with all of who we are. And so it's a constant choice. It is not an emotional or physical response to emotional or physical feelings. It is legitimately a choice that we have to decide in every opportunity presented where we can fully engage, which there is really no space that we cannot worship the Lord, because the Bible tells us He gives us direction in everything. And as we commit those things to the Lord, we are worshiping him, acknowledging him in everything we do, doing everything as unto the Lord. It doesn't even have to be religious or spiritual, but you can do it with the mindset, God, I'm doing this to the best of my ability for you, working in a steel mill or being a lawyer or being in politics. God, I'm doing the best that I can and being integral with my time and what I'm doing at this thing for your glory. So when people ask me, see the difference of how I'm being when I don't have to give the best of myself and I still choose to, then they ask the question, why do you do that? God, I can attribute that glory to you in that moment. And it's then a testimony. And that is worship, is what I don't think people always see. Those moments are worship when we are intentional. Just like our love for our wives as husbands have to be, or vice versa, our wives to the husband has to be an intentional thing. Even when this person is likable, when they're not, when they're loving and sweet, and when they're absolutely on your last nerve, it is still a choice to love this person and to be who God has called you to be. And literally, God has called us to be worshipers, and that is an intentional action and choice that has to be made in every space and opportunity where we are mindful of it.
Yeah, and we are described as the bride of Christ, and it says in the bottom of 55, now switch gears, here we are the bride of Christ, unlovable, unfaithful, adulterous, and fickle. Heaven and hell stand stupefied? Is that how you say that?
Stupefied, yeah.
And the lost are incredulous. How could anyone love such a woman? How could the perfect Prince of Peace, glorious, holy, faithful, powerful, righteous, full of beauty and light, choose such an unlovely, wayward woman? Who could love a people like the church? Only one thing will silence their doubt. Show them the ring, and he's describing Jesus is like the ring.
Yeah, so, he, as David was saying this on the page before, he was talking about how, a man, as he was getting engaged to a woman, will pick out an engagement ring. And sometimes, he has to eat ramen noodles for 6 months or bike to work or, not go to a movie or not go out with his friends because he's saving for this engagement ring. And the reason he's saving for such a beautiful ring is he wants to show that woman her worth, how much she means to him. And so what he went on to say then later on in 56, he said, what is the cross? It's the engagement ring of Christ, bought at the price of God's own Son. And then down a little bit later, if the cross proves how much we are worth to God, our worship proves how much God is worth to us. And it's, I think what David was saying, and so eloquently, is as we worship, we're really attributing that worship to God, and it's our response to how much he loved us, recognizing our own unlovableness, our own fallenness. I think, when I was a young Christian, I really thought that as I matured, Christ was going to make me this shining example of holiness, of sainthood, or something like that. What I've come to realize as I've gotten older and understand the faith more is God is working on me and changing me, and that is true. I'm not the same person that I was yesterday. I'm not the same person as I was before I got saved. But I also have come to recognize my own levels of depravity and fallenness more and more, and that has actually done an interesting thing. It's made me so much more appreciate the cross and what that sacrifice was all about. Because, when I was 20 and I was coming to the Lord, I actually thought that I had something in me that was pretty lovable that made God want to sacrifice his own son for me, As I've gone on longer and longer in the faith, I realized it was simply his love. It had nothing to do with how great I was. It had to do with how great he was. And then my response to that should be this, because it says in Romans 5:8 that he demonstrated his own love for us in this: while we were yet sinners, that Christ died for us. And it wasn't just a back then, it's a now also. I feel that every day, and I'm so thankful for it. And that's part of my worship, is saying, God, the cross was your engagement ring to me. Jesus' death on the cross was showing your love for me, and I am eternally grateful, and I don't deserve it, but I'm thankful for it. All right, so if we jump into the next section here, he starts talking about the idea of being a bondservant. And, all through Scripture, you see Paul calling himself a bondservant, James calling himself, Jude calling himself a bondservant. Now, bondservant's sort of a strange concept that we don't really understand or know about. much in our society. But, you'll read at the beginning of Galatians, for instance, it says, "For I, Paul, now persuade men or God. I don't seek to please men, for if I still please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ." Or later he says, "Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Paul and Timothy, bondservants of Jesus Christ. James, a bondservant of God. Simon Peter, a bondservant of God. Jude, a bondservant of God." And he goes on to explain that a bondservant is somebody who had been enslaved but had served their time. So a lot of times, you would go into enslavement, like an indentured servitude type of thing, if you had some debts or something like that, or even if you wanted to work for a certain amount of time. So let's say you were 5 years in that sort of indentured servitude. But when you finished that time, some masters, if they really loved that servant, would offer them to become bondservants, to still live in their households and continue to serve them. And oftentimes, those people who were slaves previously would become a bondservant. They would choose to serve their master, not out of compulsion, but because they loved their master. We also are slaves to Christ, it says, throughout the scriptures. And there's a certain level of compulsion, but we're also bondservants that serve out of love. Obviously, Jesus is not going to force us to love him. He could have made human beings who would be automatons who just, said, "I love you" and worship you all the time. But it would be like us programming a computer to say that to us. It would be meaningless to us. Obviously, we all desire people to love us just out of their own will and their own hearts. And if they don't, if it's out of compulsion, it's really not love at all. We can see that distinction easily. So how do we as worshipers, when we get up on stage Sunday after Sunday, sometimes we're compelled, if you're serving on the team, you're set on the schedule and the team needs you and you show up. Us as staffers, we show up and, it really is part of our job. If we don't show up on the weekend, we probably wouldn't have a job anymore. But how do we, walking into that environment, really make sure that our hearts are right and we're showing up not as slaves, but as bondservants? How do we distinguish that?
I think the daily going after the relationship with the Lord is huge. I know there are seasons with which I'm great at it and seasons with which I'm sucking at it, just being honest. And in the seasons where I'm sucking at it, I find it easier to be distracted when I'm on stage leading. And the crazy thing is about that, those moments, I've actually found that God has shown up more in the moments where I feel least deserving of it as well.
Yes.
I've seen like those moments where like I walk away from it and be like, "God, why did you do that? You shouldn't have shown up. You shouldn't have even because it looks like I was used powerfully, like I was so close to you in this way." And it reminds me like, hey, I'm God, not you. And I needed to talk and connect with my people, and you were the vessel that I chose to use because you were in the place to be used. But understand this, that it's also a privilege to be used by God in that way, and to have that mantle being poured through you from God. But at the same time, I know one of the things that I do when I get on stage to really help focus my heart and my mind is I pray directly. I pray just like, "God, help me to be present in the worship. Help me to hear the words and the very words that I use to encourage the people. I'm also encouraging myself and reminding myself, like, hey man, don't sing these words almost like they talk about the Pharisees praying with this vain repetition. We do the same thing with songs from times where we just sing them because we know them, and it bears no weight in our hearts of what it is that we're saying. I think some of those smaller, intimate moments, like the one worship that one Tuesday when I was singing the song, and sometimes the words really strike my heart. And when it does, I can't sing anymore. I'm in tears, and notes and tears don't go together. But I'm telling you, they don't come out the way you plan them. So, so I realized that it's those moments where I know sometimes in our services, because they're so big and pretty programmed, sometimes, and we're moving through time, you almost have to schedule that in there. But it's also realizing that the intention to the moment, taking the time to fully engage, hear the words, and sing those words, and make sure you mean them from your heart as you're lifting them up. It's an intentional action prior to, before you get on the stage in your daily life, but also when you get on stage, consecrating that moment as well to the Lord, and being clear about what it means. And I always tell people, man, prayer for me is not telling God something that he doesn't already know. It's a way of sometimes reminding ourselves of who God calls us to be in those moments, and submitting the moment to the Lord, realizing that this is not about us, and all about him, and helping his people to focus their hearts and their minds on him.
That was one of my biggest, I think, obstacles, was the idea of being on stage, not being engaged as I wanted to be, and feeling like an imposter when I got off the stage. Wow, you are supposed to be the worship leader, but yet you were just on stage, didn't once think about, you were too busy thinking about the notes you were singing, the way people were reacting to you. And then I left feeling like, who am I to be up here leading this? But in the same sense, my other issue was that I was viewing myself as someone other than just an individual worshiping God. I was viewing myself as like, oh, Chris has to be big, mighty worship leader and be the closest, and all this different stuff. And I was like, it took me some time.
The Cro-Magnon man voice.
Yeah.
Right, you just turned into a caveman. Right.
Yeah.
Rock worship God.
Yeah. But that also turned out to be my issue, was like, I was viewing this as some other, I mean, it's a responsibility that we have to be up there on stage and to be in front of people and leading them in worship, but we are also just worshipers. And that was like, you've said it in other episodes too, like the most important thing we can do is go on stage and worship God and pour ourselves out to him, even like we're talking about in the book, even whenever we may not feel it as much, because we are human. Yes. We are sinful humans, and we're not always going to walk up there and feel like angels. Yeah. We're going to have struggles, just like everyone in the room has struggles. Everyone has issues. Everyone has obstacles they're facing. And I think it's those moments, too, when we're leading and when we point that out, that turn out to be the most impactful for people, because it's like, oh, we are all in this together, worshiping God together, sharing in his glory and sharing also in the sinfulness of our humanity. And we are not alone in this battle. We are all fighting to worship God every single day. And I think that we having that perspective has been really important for me when I walk on stage, to say like, no, you need to worship God, and you need to plan, just like you're talking about with the structure of the service, because it is very structured service, and there's time limits and there's constraints that we have, but it's also planning, not planning less, but I've noticed whenever I overplan, it becomes more of a structured, robotic thing, rather than coming in, like, say, on a Saturday, and I'll know where I want to speak, what I want to somewhat say, but I'll never now write it out completely, because then it sounds like a script, and I want to be in the moment. I want to be worshiping God in the moment. I want to just go with the flow, go with the spirit, go all that stuff. I want to be in the moment, and I've noticed that almost less preparation is more preparation in a sense.
Right. Yeah, it's it makes me think a little bit of what David was saying when we were talking about the cross being sort of an engagement ring of God, showing our worth and it's our response to him. Shoot, I totally lost where I was going. I had something really, really good to say too.
I do that all the time. I was sort of gonna. I'm like, it's not there, guys. It's all gone.
It also reminds me of David was talking about how the cross, in a way, was like our engagement ring to from God to show our worth. And he was talking about how in marriage, you might think that marriage is all about, especially if you're not married yet, that it's all about romance and, candlelit dinners and holding hands and watching. But, the reality of marriage is very different, and the way that you show love in marriage for real is very different. So, my wife, if I clean the dishwasher, I have really shown love to her. And if I clean the toilet, I have really shown love to her. and she recognizes that as love, not just, bringing her flowers and writing poems to her type of thing. Not that those things are bad. You need to have the both and in your relationship with your wife, of course. There needs to be a level of romance and attraction, but there also is just the functionality of what true love really looks like. And I think it's important for us as worshipers to realize when we get up on stage there's a certain level of what we do that simply is craft. And what I mean by that is it is simply the sort of like organic mechanism that we're doing on stage. I press certain notes on my guitar and they make certain sounds, and I have to press them at the right time in the right place to make it work with everybody else. We practice to be able to do that. You know, it's what our craft is. And that takes a lot of like intentionality and focus. And that takes me to another point, which is the same point on this, that we don't always feel on stage that romance of worship. It's not always the candlelight dinner. It sometimes is the, I don't want to say, you know, cleaning the dishwasher, because it's something more than that. But, you know, if I was a surgeon and that was my job, I would want to worship God in everything that I did. If I was doing bypass surgery, I would want to be worshiping God during that. But I probably would not want to be actively thinking about worshiping God while I had that scalpel in my hand operating on that person's heart, because I would make mistakes. I've got to be totally in what I'm doing. But it doesn't make it less worshipful.
Yeah.
You know, Bach wrote on the bottom of all of his music, all for the glory of God. And I think we should do everything for the glory of God. But there is a certain recognition. It doesn't always have to feel that sort of like, I don't want to say magical feel, but, you know, that feeling of the presence of God where you know, because we all experience that from time to time, but we don't always experience that, just like you don't always experience romance in your relationship with your wife. Sometimes love looks very different. Sometimes worship can look more functional in those ways. And I think God still loves it and appreciates it if our heart is right. And that's where the rub starts. And I think that's where people see, like, when they talk about hypocrisy in the church, I think what they see is people who, you know, in part say they believe one thing and then live a certain way the other way, but also I think they do see that coldness towards God with their hearts. I think they really see these people who are like working to please God, but, you know, sort of have these like cold, caustic hearts that they. But when they come across people who are really loving and warm and really love and worship God, I think they see something different. And again, David was speaking to that in one of the last podcasts. You know, we become winsome to people when they see our true love for God and our true passion for God. So I think there's a both and.
And that's where like the constant worship, I think, comes in, where it's not like it's constantly displaying worship to God, not only on Sundays when we're here at church, but finding the moments where when we're with other people that may not be believers and we find a moment there to worship God and to make that known. Those are the moments that I think where the person can go, oh, that's what his faith means to him. Like, it reminds me of my wife Jansen. The most impactful things that I can do for her is to just do random things to show that I'm thinking about her without her knowing. Like, so if I'm out at the store, her favorite candy is Sour Patch Kids. If I'm out at the store and or even if I'm coming back from a rehearsal and I pass like a Giant Eagle or a Shop and Save or something, I'll run in sometimes, grab her Sour Patch Kids, bring it home, and that to her is more impactful than if I would go and buy her this giant piece of jewelry that's super expensive, because it shows like, oh, at a moment where I was simply...
I'm thinking Jansen doesn't feel that way.
What?
I just have to counter that. I think if you bought a big giant piece of jewelry, she would probably think differently about it. Over Sour Patch Kids.
I don't know. I'd always pick the Sour Patch Kids, but
I think that's your disillusionment right there.
Well, maybe it is, but I would. But it shows it like in the moments where she wasn't expecting it, where I was just driving home, she was on my mind. I was thinking about her, and I think that needs to be reciprocated when we approach God, when we approach Jesus. Like, let's not. Because we feel obligated to every single second of the day, but just those random moments where we are driving home. Hey, God, thank you for the opportunity to, little tiny minor things like the fact that I'm healthy enough to drive this car home to my home that's heated, that I'm lucky enough to have a loving wife who loves Sour Patch Kids as much as I do. And all of that stuff, I think is just incredibly important and probably more impactful, because it's not coming from a place of obligation. It's coming from a place of true love and true thoughtfulness.
Yes, and I think that's right. You know, it is, those little moments oftentimes that I think God really appreciates, not just, us trying to work up some sort of worship experience when we're worshiping. You know, like last night I was going to a rehearsal for worship, and there was an incredible sunset, and I just stopped and I looked at the sunset for just a couple minutes, and I was just worshiping God. And then I went into this worship rehearsal, and I think the moment that I was worshiping God for the beauty of that sunset was probably more worshipful than what happened in a lot of the worship rehearsal, to be honest with you. You know? But I think God can appreciate and honor both. I think He honors even the commitment, the sacrifice of praise we bring when we come and show up. If it's with the right mindset and with the right heart, where we're saying, God, I'm really giving this to you. This is for you. And even during a worship set, I might be so compelled with what I'm doing that I'm not really totally focusing my attention on you all the time. I think it's easier for vocalists, incidentally, but nonetheless, I think God honors that and He appreciates it if we really are trying to give that to Him as an act of worship. Yeah. Well, let's close with this. On page 62, closing out the book, he says, He knows how to take His people from doubt to faith, from gratitude to praise, from submission to transformation, to communion, to fruitfulness, to intercession, to glory. He knows how to bring us to Him and change us into His likeness. He is the accessible God, and waiting on Him means serving at the table while He communes with His bride. And as a bonus, we're also part of that bride. So I know we're all thankful to be part of the body of Christ and be that bride of Christ. So I think that's probably it for today.
Amen.
Amen.
I don't know if that was
Thank you for listening to the Worship Podcast.
Figured we sing since
Now you know how to worship a king. Hello there, it is Chris, and thank you so much for listening to episode 9 of Walking in Worship. Join us next time as we dive into chapter 5 of Zach Neese's book, How to Worship a King. And like always, walk with us towards a deeper understanding of what worship truly is.